The test is in 4 parts: Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4. Now look at Part 1.
Part 1.
You'll hear a conversation between Alan and Gianna, the office counsellor of a company. First, you have some time to read questions 1 to 6. Now listen to the conversation and answer questions 1 to 6. What's up, Gianna? You look like you're in bad shape.
Yes, maybe I'll get sick leave from the boss and finally catch up on some sleep. I've barely eaten and slept in days.
Those are warning signs of occupational stress. How are things at work?
Terrible. After all the layoffs lately, the workload is totally overwhelming for everyone that's left. So I spend every waking moment in the office. I'm kept busy all the time.
So you need to take a few minutes break every so often to clear and refresh your mind.
But my boss will complain I'm not hard-working. She's so capricious that you can't predict her reaction sometimes.
Maybe your boss just doesn't have a clue about how much you're really doing. Keep her updated on your achievements and projects. Also insist that she prioritize everything so you can manage your time better.
That's right. I suppose that would help me regain some sense of control, but I'm afraid that she'll take that as a sign of laziness and give me the axe.
So take the initiative and hit the job hunting trail now. You'll be surprised at how many opportunities are out there.
That's encouraging.
Anyway, you should cheer up and get rid of the situation. You know, according to a survey, about 40% of all people find their work very stressful, and 25% develop mental or physical diseases. Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen to the conversation and answer questions 7 to 10.
So serious? I didn't know that. How do the problems start?
You know, they start when conflicts at work induces stress. Your body reacts by flooding the bloodstream with hormones that tense up your muscles and increase your blood pressure. This is meant to save you in a fight or flight situation, but leads to a host of illnesses, ranging from insomnia and headaches to heart attacks, when it occurs regularly over an extended period of time.
What should I do to prevent such things happening?
Well, most occupational stress is attributed to a recognized lack of control. You should act in advance to relieve the problems. For example, you should actively pursue career opportunities rather than quietly worry about getting fired. Of course, you can't control everything, so you need to help your mind and body cope. Keep a journal to release your frustrations, take short walks to calm down, or if necessary, simply take a mental health day.
That is the end of Part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to Part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear two students discussing a project on international festivals with their tutor.
First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
Good morning. Shall we start by looking at the topic of your project? So, what have you decided to research?
Well, we thought we'd compare festivals in different countries and see if any of them are similar.
Yeah, you know, like the carnival celebrations in South America and the water festival in Thailand.
OK. What exactly are you planning to study? The origins of the festivals? The types of celebration? People's attitudes towards the festivals?
We were planning to look at the origins of the festivals and the time of year they're celebrated. We're thinking of looking at the connection between the seasons in different countries and the actual festivals, and then looking for similarities between countries that are quite far apart.
Well, that sounds interesting. Did you say you've already started researching into the carnival?
Yes. We've already found a connection between the carnival and the seasons. For instance, some researchers say that a very long time ago in Europe, people used to put on colourful masks and costumes at the beginning of the year to celebrate the end of winter, and then they could get ready for spring.
Right. And then what happened?
Well, as the years went by, the purpose of the carnival changed, and it became a religious festival. These days, there are big carnival celebrations in countries all across the world, like Brazil and India and Indonesia. But an interesting thing we discovered is that in some countries, people celebrate the carnival by throwing water at each other in the street. Well, we thought that obviously this is because carnival's celebrated at the hottest time of the year, just before the rainy season. So splashing people with water is a very good way of cooling them down.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Yes, that makes sense. Did you look into any other festivals?
Yes, we did. What we're planning to do is more research into water festivals. We found that in Asian countries, where there aren't any carnival celebrations, there are still festivals that involve people splashing each other with water. Actually, we found references to them in Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, China and Japan. But we also found a reference to a water festival in Mexico. So we thought we'd look into that a bit more and see if we can find any similarities between these countries. We realised that water is more than just a way of cooling people down in hot weather. It also has a lot of different religious meanings and purposes. For instance, we found that in some societies, water can mean life or wealth or just luck.
Yes, and another thing we found out is that these water festivals often celebrate the beginning of the new year, just like the original celebrations hundreds of years ago before the carnival. So, up to now, we found that the carnival and the seasons are linked by ancient traditions, and that water plays an important part in the celebrations.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
You will hear part of a talk on cultural research.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Having referred briefly to the general definition of culture, I want to move on to an example of cultural research in action, a real example of what researchers into culture are doing. This is a study done in 2004 into the global teenager hypothesis. Now, the global teenager hypothesis states that the values and attitudes of teenagers all over the world have become very similar, that teenagers are part of a global culture, rather than a national or a regional one. This study investigated the subject of materialism in 3 different cultures. It asked if teenagers' attitudes to materialism were similar or different in those 3 different cultures. I'd like to go through the main points of this study because I think it demonstrates the interest and usefulness of this kind of research. The research took a sample of 556 high school students of between 14 and 17 years of age from 3 countries. The 3 countries, being also 3 differing cultures, were China, Japan, and the USA. The high schools were in medium-sized cities, and the students came from middle-class areas. There were 172 respondents from China, 168 from Japan, and 216 from the USA. The students were asked to reply to a questionnaire or survey, which consisted of 7 statements. They were asked to say if they agreed or disagreed with the statements. The questionnaire was filled in during the students' regular class time. I'll give you some examples of the statements in the questionnaire. And, by the way, if you want to look into this in further detail, I've got the reference here. Let me see. Oh yes, it's the International Journal of Consumer Studies, Volume 28, Number 4, of September 2004. The first statement was, "It is really true that money can make you happy." Respondents were asked, as they were asked about all the statements, to give their answer on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 on the scale indicated, "I strongly disagree." 4 on the scale was neutral. And 7 on the scale was, "I strongly agree." The second statement was, "My dream in life is to be able to own expensive things." And the 5th was, "Having the right possessions is the most important thing in life." Let's look at some of the results.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
I'm sorry.
Let's look at some of the results. With regard to the first statement, it was the Japanese teenagers who agreed most strongly that money could make you happy. The Americans were second, and the Chinese agreed least. However, regarding one's life dream being to own expensive things, it was American teenagers who agreed most strongly with this, and the Chinese who agreed least. As regards the 5th statement about owning the right things, the Americans agreed less strongly than the other 2 groups. It was the Chinese who agreed most strongly with this statement. I haven't been able to analyse all aspects of the study in this lecture, but it does suggest that the hypothesis is not supported by the data. It may be that the culture of the USA is more individualistic, whereas the Chinese culture is more collectivist or communitarian. However, it does not seem to support the global teenager hypothesis. As always, This is something on which we need to carry out more research.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
You are going to hear a talk about the English pubs. As you listen, complete the notes below.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
In English pubs, the food is usually plain but of good quality. In fact, to taste good, traditional English food, you would do well to visit a reputable pub. Many businessmen habitually have lunch in a pub near their office. In the country, the pub is often part of an inn where you can put up for the night. The Englishman's favourite drink is beer. There are 3 different methods of serving beer in Britain. As you'd expect, some beer is served in bottles. Beer that comes from a tap is called draft beer, and there are 2 different methods of serving it. Keg beer is served with modern method, which uses a gas called carbon dioxide, and traditional draft has no gas in it, and a pump is used to pull the beer up the pipe and out of the tap. Keg beer is served colder than traditional draft. It's easier to look after, and some keg beers are sold almost everywhere in Britain. This means that you can always have exactly the same drink in any pub that sells a particular keg beer. Traditional British beer is probably quite different from the beer in your country. It has no gas in it, and it's not served very cold. But this is not a mistake. Traditional beer drinkers will tell you that this allows you to taste the beer better. Traditional draft is not always looked after as well as it should be, but in a good pub, a traditional draft beer drinker will tell you there can be no better drink. There are a lot of different breweries, companies that make beer, in Britain, but they make the same types of beer, and you can see them in the list below. Lager is the kind of beer that is common in many countries. Normally keg is served cold. Strong lager is often available in bottles. Bitter is the most popular kind of British beer. It tastes slightly bitter and can be keg or traditional draft. Most pubs have more than one kind. Guinness is a thick, almost black, bitter-tasting Irish beer. Pale ale is less strong and a bit sweeter than bitter, and often is keg. Mild is a fairly sweet beer, often dark, not as strong as bitter. It can be keg or traditional. It cannot be found everywhere. Bottled beers are sometimes served cold. There are several kinds available. For example, light ale like pale ale. Brown ale is a brown, often rather sweet beer. Stout is a very dark beer. Law regulates the pub's opening times. Local variations are possible, but usually a pub is open from 11:30 to 3 o'clock, and from 5:30 to 10:30 or 11 o'clock. Betting is forbidden in pubs. Children are not allowed on licensed premises, which may mean that father and mother cannot have a quiet drink together if children are with them. In the old days, when people drank too much and pubs were often rowdy, the law against children entering pubs was a wise one. Today, drunkenness is much less frequent than it was, say 50 years ago. It would be quite wrong to consider the average English pub as anything other than a respectable, friendly place that provides good drink, good food, and a pleasant social atmosphere. Far too often the foreigner has read accounts of sordid 19th century drinking places, haunted by people whose one desire was to drink as much as they could afford as quickly as possible.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.